Can I go? Okay. Quote, for despite comforting illusions and some evidence to the contrary, the formally trained and well-honed mind has always encountered suspicion and distrust in this country. And it was against this suspicion and distrust that John F. Kennedy made a singular contribution. He did this by recognizing and honoring intellect as a spring of national well-being to a degree previously unknown in modern American history, by appealing to the nation's campuses and laboratories to lend their best minds to government, and by never relenting in his conviction that education and intellectual growth and freedom are indispensable to the nation's welfare and safety, end quote. This quote comes from Greenberg's and John Walsh's article, John F. Kennedy. Many events throughout John F. Kennedy's presidency caused him to be one of the most known presidents ever in United States history. These events drew critics and researchers to evaluate the image he created for himself within his family and presidency. In my informative speech, I will provide information about John F. Kennedy's life from his first congressional campaign in 1946 to his assassination in 1963. At the beginning of his life, John F. Kennedy looked at the bad side of his life. He served in the Navy and almost died in World War II. It is mentioned multiple times in the article John Fitzgerald Kennedy by Arthur Schlesinger that John F. Kennedy thought he felt too much sometimes, so he decided to distance himself from emotions. Because of this, he called himself a pessimist about the future in his 5-year report of being a member of the class of 1940 at Harvard University. In the article John F. Kennedy by Elizabeth Saunders, she quotes, quote, during his first congressional campaign in 1946, Kennedy delivered several versions of his speech, taking a hard line with the Soviets, extensively detailing Soviet internal repression, end quote. These speeches showed how he would approach the Cold War, and he gained many support throughout the nation. He also viewed Soviets as aggressive and that they advocated containment. According to the article, Apparent Perfection, The Image of John F. Kennedy by Mark White, John F. Kennedy was elected in the House of Representatives in 1946 and became a senator from Massachusetts. Then in 1952, he won the election as Senate. In 1953, he married Jackie Bober, his wife. John F. Kennedy had a foreign policy set in place throughout his Congress years, and he did not want to ignore the Soviet aggression taking place, along with third world countries' domestic problems. By 1951, Kennedy was concerned third world countries were going communist. Having set a foreign policy before his presidential campaign, it allowed Kennedy to be ahead of the game and gain as much support as he could when he needed it the most. Now that we've learned about his early years leading to his presidency, let's talk about his beliefs and values as a Democrat. John F. Kennedy was a very confident person. In the article John F. Kennedy by Stephen Calabresi, it is quoted, quote, John F. Kennedy viewed himself as a strong, active president, end quote. His goal was to inspire the United States to protect civil rights and support anti-communism overseas. To achieve this, he would make the statement, quote, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, end quote, Calabresi. The nation saw him as a leader and a picture as a public speaker. Calabresi mentions John F. Kennedy used his power to enforce civil rights. John F. Kennedy helped James Meredith, a black student, join the University of Mississippi and issued a proclamation when he heard of violence occurring. There were many protests going on around the campuses because they did not want a black student attending their university. He also helped 2 black students enroll at the University of Alabama, and he fought against Alabama's segregationist governor, George Wallace. Greenberg and John Walsh also concluded that John F. Kennedy thought that freedom, education, and intellectual growth were important to the nation's welfare and safety. Greenberg and John Walsh quoted, quote, he was always responsive to proposals to put more money into education and research, end quote. He also wanted to enhance and utilize the nation's intellectual resources. Kennedy's values towards making the nation greater through education and research is what shaped his legacy. Quote, his style, his determination, and his optimism are his legacy, end quote, Greenberg and Walsh. John F. Kennedy paid more attention to third world countries because of communist takeovers. He thought because of the poor condition they were in, they were more likely to be taken over and turned communist. John F. Kennedy also valued America's alliances. Kennedy stated, quote, unless we can develop an economic program which embraces the Middle East regionally and which stimulates multilateral assistance in the area, the Baghdad Pact will have little effective influence, end quote, Sanders. The Baghdad Pact represents a belief that military alliance can provide stability, and without it, third world countries would be unstable. Now that we've learned about John F. Kennedy's beliefs, we can talk about his presidency. Before he became president, the nation thought he created the image of a war hero, family symbol, politician, and man of letters, paraphrased from White. Throughout his presidential campaign in 1960, Kennedy claimed he and the American people would join together in an act of national self-renewal, paraphrased from White. John F. Kennedy valued working together with the nation rather than working against each other. He wanted a purpose for the nation, and in a speech on American University, he wanted to make the world safe for diversity. Paraphrase from Schlesinger. He also states he wanted to connect with the American people during his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles on July 15, 1960. In his inaugural address on January 20th, 1961, he said that the 1960s would be a challenge that would require a quote-unquote, an exceptional brand of leadership that he could provide, along with self-sacrifice that the nation would have to make. Paraphrase from White. Quote, the marking of him being the youngest president ever in American history strengthened Kennedy's reputation as a precocious politician, end quote, White. Kennedy wanted to focus on third world domestic problems, and he had created a plan for this before he became president. Records showed Kennedy created this plan in his years in Congress. Kennedy's beliefs saw threats in communist regimes and anti-communist dictatorships, which led to invest in transformative strategies, like the Baghdad Pact. Now that we've talked about John F. Kennedy's presidency, we can talk about his death. Michael Kurtz states in the article, The Assassination of John F. Kennedy, A Historical Perspective, quote, on November 22nd, 1963, at 12:30 p.m., President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was murdered in Dallas, Texas. Few events in recent American history have had such a traumatic impact upon the American people, end quote. John F. Kennedy's death was a shock to the nation, and it was very hard to admit that he was gone because so many people looked up to him. Kennedy's death was under investigation by the FBI, the Warren Commission, and also the House Select Committee. Texas law did not like, the state of Texas did not like that so many people were investigating his death, so they declared that the Dallas Police Department would lead the investigation. Soon, the Dallas Police Department concluded Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin, but the FBI believed otherwise. Then, on November 24th, 1963, Jack Ruby walked into the basement of the Dallas Police Department during a press conference and shot Lee Harvey Oswald in front of 70 law enforcement officers. Paraphrase from Kurtz. Beginning in the article, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King states, quote, it is not necessary to create myths and legends about John F. Kennedy. It would diminish him because the fact abundantly honor him, end quote. Throughout this article, Martin Luther King constantly talks about the elements that shaped John F. Kennedy's presidency and the legacy he left behind. One of the elements he talked about was his outlook. Martin Luther King said that no other American president had, quote, written with such compassion and resolution to make clear that our nation's destiny was unfulfilled so long as a scar of racial prejudice disfigured it, end quote. Martin Luther King compares Kennedy to other leaders with this quote, quote, many political leaders refuse to act when a mass movement is exploding with intensity. President Kennedy might have said, as had others, that he would not proceed under pressure as if it were a virtue to ignore mass protest. Instead, he frankly acknowledged that he was responding to mass demands and did so because he thought it was right to do so. He was responsive, sensitive, humble before the people, and bold on their behalf, end quote. This article continuously talks about the impact he left on so many lives. Throughout my speech, I informed my audience about Kennedy's presidency and events in his life that shaped his values and beliefs. I also gave information about his assassination in 1963. Now that you know a little more information about John F. Kennedy and who he was, I hope you'll retain this information and hopefully use it in the future. This is my works cited, and thank you for listening to my speech.